I wonder how many of us remember the late lamented crooner Max Bygraves. Yeah, I can see Sandra smiling already, you see. I knew that would happen. Yeah, he had one of those catchphrases, didn't he, which impressionists would copy so that everyone knew straight away that they were impersonating Max Bygraves. For him, it was, "I want to tell you a story." Yeah? Was that a good impersonation? Yeah, it wasn't bad, was it? Yeah. And then, of course, old Max would start to sing all sorts of wonderful imaginary stories. There was the question, what noise annoys an oyster, which was rather magnificent. And then there was that song, do you remember, about the imaginary tiny house by the tiny sea in Gilly Gilly, Ossenpfeffer, Katzenellenbogen by the sea. Yeah, do you remember it? Yeah. And then I think my particular favourite was You're a Pink Toothbrush, which was the story of a romance between a pink dental hygiene instrument and a blue one. Yeah. The genius of Max Bygraves, like so many before him, was that he realised human beings are hardwired for stories. We love them. From Homer's Iliad and the story of Noah's Ark, to the latest movies on our screen or the novels on our shelves, there's nothing we enjoy more than losing ourselves in a good story. Stories have power, you see. We see ourselves and our lives reflected back at us in stories. We identify ourselves, or at least our aspirations, the aspirations of who we would like to be, in the lines of stories. Romantic stories wake up our emotions and help us perhaps to find the romance in our own lives. Heroic tales of daring do enable us to imagine ourselves as the hero of the story. They lift our hearts and they lift our eyes to bigger and greater horizons. And stories in the Bible are no exception. The stories of the Hebrew Bible are often centered around a great hero who, by obeying God's command, carries out a mighty deed. Noah, Abraham, Moses, Joshua, David, Daniel, they're all heroes, made of heroic stuff, which inspires us to also seek God's will and to become heroes ourselves. And Jesus, out of that tradition, understood the power of stories, which is why he told so many parables. But when his disciples asked him why he used so many parables, his reply, as we just heard in our gospel reading, was, well, shall we say, enigmatic, to say the least. Now, we don't have time for a line-by-line examination of the gospel text, you'll be glad to know. But what I think Jesus was pointing to was this. He noticed that the people had become deaf to the wisdom of God, especially as it was taught to them by the religious leaders of the day. They taught the people rules and regulations, dogmas to be believed and followed. But the result, as Jesus says, was that seeing they do not perceive, and hearing they do not listen, nor do they understand. Jesus attempted to break through the logjam by reimagining the faith in terms of stories. These were stories about fishermen and bakers, farmers and homemakers, ordinary people, in fact. He invited his listeners to see themselves in these stories, just as storytellers have always done. He sought to reawaken their imaginations, and by doing so, reawaken their hearts to receive the message of God's love. And we too are invited to do the same, are we not? When we read the scriptures, we're invited not to get too bogged down in the questions that the theologians might ask, The detailed questions, perhaps about whether this event or that event really happened exactly as it was recorded, or whether this or that story is provable by modern archaeology. We're invited instead to ask what this story says to our heart. How does it lift our imaginations beyond the humdrum, everyday nature of our existence? How does it inspire us to go further, go deeper, be braver, more loving, more steadfast? So, when you read the creation story, don't worry about how many days it was completed in, and exactly on what date. Ask yourself instead how you can be involved in God's ongoing act of creation. When you read the story of Moses crossing the Red Sea, don't get caught up in questions of how likely or unlikely the story is. Rather, focus on what the barriers are in your life. What is the Red Sea that you need to cross? And how might God help you to cross it? When you read of tiny David defeating gigantic Goliath, don't get caught up in the questions about who the Philistines were and still are today. Instead, take courage that even you, with your small skills, can make a difference in the world. Let the power of these stories and the parables of Jesus seep into your heart. Let them challenge and encourage you to ever greater works for the kingdom of heaven. Amen.